there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
For over a century, the legendary tales that have surrounded our great British airfields have inspired generations of people, including me, which is why I am on a personal mission to cross the UK to visit some of our most important airfields, to understand not just about their contribution to our past, but importantly, how many of them have helped define our future. From the UK's first flight, through to groundbreaking innovations such as carbon fibre and the jet engine, and the extraordinary effort spent on preserving our aviation heritage. Join me as I explore the story of the airfields that have helped shape Britain and the world. Well, this is what was once part of RAF Bentwaters, the last RAF base to be activated during the Second World War. Its first mission, a bomber escort in December of 1944. But it's the 4 decades that followed that conflict, the period known as the Cold War, that's really come to define what Bentwaters is really all about. For over 40 years, Bentwaters was in the front line of the defence of Western Europe, but not as an RAF base, because in 1951, the Americans moved in. And over the years that followed, they brought with them not just aircraft, but importantly, nuclear weapons. In its heyday, this sprawling complex was one of the most secretive and restricted sites in the country. Many of the aircraft shelters at Bentwaters today are used for industrial or agricultural purposes. But a few still house historic Cold War aircraft, keeping alive the spirit of the airfield. Al, hello mate, nice to see you.
Hi Jules.
What a fantastic collection. Many people, I suppose, would be surprised to think that those men and women who fought during the Second World War would find themselves facing a new war, a Cold War. Who first coined the phrase?
The actual title of Cold War was actually christened by George Orwell. He wrote an article in 1945 about the nuclear future, and said it would be a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western powers.
And that previous kind of allied relationship between the Western powers and Russia in particular was notoriously fractious even during the war, but it disintegrates almost as soon as the war is over.
It was. I mean, they had the common enemy, which was the Nazi Germany, but basically the Soviet Union and the West had nothing in common. One was totalitarian states, the other Western powers were democracies.
And in terms of the Russian perspective, obviously they'd suffered hugely during the war itself, but what were they seeking? What was their issue?
They were seeking, basically, they wanted to spread of communism around the world, which was basically Stalin's policy. The West themselves wanted free governments in Eastern Europe. The Russians would not allow that. The communists took over the Eastern European states.
And it became a game of brinkmanship, didn't it? Of spying, of counter-spying, of threat and counter-threat, and deterrent and counter-deterrent. And all of that is predicated upon the new nuclear age.
Yes, it was. I mean, the Americans had the bomb in 1945. The Russians developed bombs with espionage, and their own scientists in 1949 was their first weapon, which is a copy of the Fat Man bomb. And then the development at pace went through to the thermonuclear weapons in the early 50s. Russia
and the Western Allies never directly came head-to-head, did they?
No, apart from instances with Francis Gary Powers in 1960 with the shooting down of his U-2 spy plane over Russia.
And of course the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the missile crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is widely considered to be the most acute point in the Cold War, when the standoff between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was on the verge of turning into a full-blown nuclear conflict. In October 1962, the Americans discovered missile sites on Cuba, putting the United States within range of Soviet nuclear weapons. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further missiles and nuclear warheads arriving on the island. The Russians saw it as an act of war. Both sides were on a collision course.
Now, within this hangar, we've got some amazing examples of some of the finest, I suppose, post-war jet fighters and bombers ever built. Can we start with this one, probably the latest of the lot, the Jaguar? You're restoring this at the moment.
Yes. Originally designed to be a trainer, it was converted with the NATO change to a flexible response to any Soviet aggression to being a tactical nuclear strike aircraft.
And over my shoulder here we've got the Lightning?
Yes.
What was the Lightning's role?
The Lightning was a Mach 2 interceptor, short range for defence of NATO areas. Very fast, very short of range. It was designed originally as a research project by English Electric in the 50s and then was developed into a fighter.
And its primary role then, presumably, was in shooting down Russian bombers?
It was designed to intercept Russian nuclear bombers, yes.
And then in the corner, the unmistakable outline of the Meteor. That really, I suppose, is where the post-war jet age begins for the RAF.
It was the first British fighter into service with jet power in 1944.
Is it possible to ever come to any sort of a conclusion as to who would have won if, God forbid, the Cold War had turned into a much hotter war?
We'd all have been losers. As the Americans have said to me, I've been on trips to America before, and they said nobody would have won it.
From the late 1940s to the early 1990s, the high tension between the Western Allies and the Eastern Bloc triggered an arms race, both sides making enormous advances in aviation technology.
You know, the story of aviation engineering is one of a century of staggering technological advances, but perhaps the most pivotal moment was that leap from the piston-engine aircraft of the Second World War to the age of the jet. This pioneering invention, championed by a British engineer, would transform the future of aviation around the world.
In March 1930, a young Central Flying School instructor submitted the first patent for a turbojet engine. Sir Frank Whittle, known as the founder of the jet engine, had spent years developing and testing new methods for flying.
Frank Whittle at the time realised that we needed to fly higher and faster, and therefore we needed a different type of engine to do that.
By 1932, the patent for a turbojet had been granted, but with little support from the RAF and the Air Council, the patent became available around the world.
1 year after the patent was granted, the Germans started working on developing their jet engine. Their first jet engine powered aircraft, the Heinkel 178, flew in 1939, and then the British jet engine flew in the Gloster in 1942. Whittle, again, had difficulty getting his idea recognised, so that's why it took so much longer for the UK to actually have a flying aircraft.
Despite initial concerns about the development of the jet engine, the British government soon realised that air supremacy was vital, and it recognised the need to explore new technology, moving away from piston engines to the turbojet.
The jet engine, in simple terms, is suck, squeeze, bang, blow. The compressor sucks in the air and squeezes it to a higher pressure. That high pressure air then moves into the combustion chamber where the fuel is burnt in the air. There's a massive expansion taking place inside the combustion chamber which forces a jet of hot air out down the tailpipe of the engine, which pushes the aircraft forwards. It was very important to have jet engines to deal with the threat from the Cold War. Basically, Britain developed a number of aircraft, jet-powered aircraft. The Vulcan bomber was developed to carry an atomic bomb, if required, and also the Lightning, which was a supersonic interceptor aircraft. So it was extremely important for Britain to remain as a superpower, to have that technology.
With the new technology, the rate at which aircraft capabilities increased was staggering, ushering in a new era of aerial warfare.
Now, shortly before the Americans arrived at Bentwaters, it was home to a squadron of Meteors, the RAF's first jet engine fighter. Now, across the series, I've been lucky enough to fly in some fantastic aircraft, not least, of course, the Spitfire, arguably one of the war's most iconic aircraft. But in terms of technology, what's astonishing is that the later Spitfires were contemporary with the earliest Meteors. But what difference did the jet engine really make to the world of the fighter pilot? Well, as you can probably tell, I'm about to find out, because here at Coventry Airport, they've got one. Dan!
Jules, hi.
Good to see you.
And to see you.
And really good to see this, a fully functioning Meteor. Who'd have thought
Yep,
it?
absolutely. This is a great aeroplane. It was built here in 1956.
Wow.
and actually is very, very close to the original Meteor airplanes, which of course were flying at about the same time at the end of the war with Spitfires.
Now, one thing that I think is remarkable across the story of aviation over the last 100 years are the profound leaps and bounds that were made.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great example of it. The Spitfire, of course, very iconic, lots of different variants, but all propeller driven. And yet, contemporary to those later models, we've got the jet engine.
Absolutely, and it really, really moved on aeroplanes in speed, in height, and in flexibility, of course, because all of a sudden, this could go up to 60, 70,000 feet. And of course the Spitfire with its propeller couldn't.
And rate of climb?
The very early Meteors were about the same as the Spitfire, but this one of course is much better. And I think you'll see if you come flying with me that this will be a lot better than the Spitfire.
Now, what have you flown before this?
Well, I was military before, so Harriers. I was then lucky enough to go to Edwards in America to do my test pilot course. So flew all the sort of American airplanes, F-15, F-16s, and then went into the UK Civil Aviation Authority, and then flew airliners, so including the A380 and things like that.
Well, I am in very good hands,
Good.
clearly.
Let's
Brilliant.
go.
Right, talk me through it.
Okay, so if you would like to go around that side, you're going to put a foot in there and then step over and in.
Ooh, it's roomier than a Spitfire.
It is. Okay, that's us closed up.
Tiger 1, roger. Report ready to taxi.
Okay, Tiger 1. Okay, so here we go.
We can already feel that thrust behind me rather than the propeller, of course, where it's all at the front dragging you forward.
Exactly.
And nice to think, Dan, that this aircraft was built here at Coventry and she's still flying from here.
It was 1956 this particular aeroplane was built. As you say, actually here at Baggington, Coventry. Okay, you okay in the back, Jules?
I'm okay. My first flight in a jet fighter.
You're going to love this.
Be nice to me.
Okay, Jules, releasing in 3, 2, 1, now.
I can already feel myself being thrown back into my seat. Very light on the nose wheel. All that thrust.
So here we go, breaking the ground.
And we're up.
Up she goes.
Beautiful. Wow.
Okay, you ready for that roll?
Let's try a roll.
Okay, nose coming up a little bit.
Oh.
Bit of G.
Oh, yeah, there's some G.
And roll.
Oh, my God. Oh, there's the ground up my head. Oh, yes. Well, you get that one quiet.
A bit of G coming on.
Yep. Oh, there it is. Oh, I'm feeling quite compressed into my seat.
That's about 3G you're pulling at the moment.
That feels quite heavy, but very graceful, with these two engines pushing us through the air, banking to the left.
You're doing about 400 miles an hour now.
Now, Dan, you were a test pilot yourself, of course.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it was like for those test pilots who'd grown up in Hurricanes and Spitfires, getting into one of these for the first time in 1943-44?
It must have been a very exciting age. Really must, because at the end of the day, it was just so much faster than the Spitfire, and so much smoother, of course. Very quick acceleration, very quick to speed. It would take a Spitfire a long time to get to this sort of speed.
But when you think, you know, from say 1910 to 1944, when this aircraft first took to the skies, it's what, 30 years, 35 years. What a difference. I mean, just looking around me now at the cockpit, the instruments, the materials that were being used, those early pioneers could have had no idea what they were unleashing in terms of that technological rush that led to these aircraft.
Absolutely, absolutely. It came on in leaps and bounds.
Well, there we are. And a few more G just for the hell of it.
Beautiful.
Oh, look at that. The response of these engines is immediate.
It is. Completely different to what you might think from these early jet engines.
There we are. Not the clearest day in the world, but my goodness me. In many ways, it's not what you can see in these aircraft that makes a difference. It's what you feel.
Exactly. So coming into land then, doing about 140 miles an hour.
Not that you'd know. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I could do this all day long. There we go. Graceful, graceful. Well, sadly that was over all too quickly, but I will cherish every moment, every minute and every second. In August 1945, more or less a year since the first Meteors became operational, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing to a dramatic end the Second World War. But in so doing, they also ushered in a new age, the age of the nuclear weapon, and triggered an arms race that saw the world's leading nations scramble to equip themselves with their own devastating nuclear arsenals.
Orford Nest has always been a very secret site, even since the First World War. It was all about secrecy and developing weapons, particularly associated with aerial warfare.
To keep up with the Americans and the Russians, the UK set about developing their own nuclear arsenal, and the first British nuclear weapon was tested in 1952. 8 miles to the south of Bentwaters lies Orford Ness on the Suffolk coast, and it's here that further testing was carried out.
The work started here in 1954 with the construction of the first of the laboratories, Laboratory 1, which looked at vibration and shock drop testing. Work pressed ahead on all sorts of weapons. Initially, Blue Danube, Britain's first operational atomic bomb, was tested here. Chief concern was about the safety of the devices. I suppose the most crude way of putting it was that they went off when they were supposed to and didn't when they weren't. They could conduct environmental tests on the device and its constituent parts. And what they were really trying to do was to put those parts through all the rigours they may go through, from storage to impact, and included things like vibration. So they were trying to mimic the vibration in an aircraft, shock drops, so accidental knocks and bangs, G-forces, G-pulses, all events that may happen.
The tests were carried out using dummy nuclear weapons. However, the bombs still contained considerable amounts of conventional explosives, in some cases up to 2.5 tons.
If anything should go wrong, that location, plus the fact that we have these massive structures, in some places 10-foot thick reinforced concrete walls and these huge roofs, and lots of shingle which provide mass in the event of an explosion to absorb that energy. All these buildings are still standing, so there never was a major accident here. Orford was an extremely important site. It's one of not many sites in the world associated with the development of nuclear weapons. What we're seeing, represented by particularly the buildings colloquially called the pagodas, is that they're really there as symbols of man's potential to destruction, really. I suppose you could probably sum it up in that phrase, MAD, mutually assured destruction. That's really what it was about. And within the Cold War, a lot of it was as much about posturing and about showing your strength to the other side as it was about actually your ability to actually, create the weapons or to deliver them. There is very little evidence of what happened in them. And over time, no doubt, further information will be released and images will come to light, perhaps showing what was going on in the buildings. But I think the key thing really is that they are very symbolic of that sort of mad time.
By 1952, the United States, Britain and Russia all had nuclear weapons, and the Cold War was beginning to heat up. The Western Allies, under the recently formed NATO, started to coordinate their defences, and America started taking over air bases right across Europe. With money seemingly no object, they invested heavily, building enormous bomb stores like this one at Bentwaters, filling them to the brim with weapons they hoped they'd never have to use. When the American Air Force first arrived at Bentwaters, their role was primarily to bolster the RAF's air defences. But in 1954, when they brought over their fleet of F-84 Thunderstreak fighter bombers, all that changed because the Thunderstreak could carry nuclear weapons. Richard!
Jules!
Hello, mate. I was just wondering how I was going to get in. It's
Thought I'd
astonishing.
open the gate for you.
Good to see you. I'm astonished to get the chance to have a good look at this. I mean, I've been shown around many things in my time, but never a former nuclear bomb store.
Well, there are very few of these left in the country anywhere, and there are very few that any civilian can get inside even now.
Well, it still feels very secure. I mean, these great big gates and these astonishing belts of wire and fences.
You've got the gate you've just come through, fully motorised, so when you want to bring your vehicle in, you drive up to the gate and the guy in the guardhouse lets you in, but he only lets you in this far.
So this is like a sort of area of containment, is it?
Absolutely, a containment area. Your vehicle comes in here and you stop. They check out who you are and they say, yeah, you're fine. And that gate shuts. And when they're really sure that you're the right person, then they open the inner gate and you can carry on in. Otherwise, you're trapped. So if the wrong person's come this far, goodness knows how they'd have got this far, then they're not going to go anywhere further.
Now, you speak about this with great passion and conviction, Richard, and I understand that some time ago you had the job of guarding facilities like this.
Yeah, when I was a young flying officer in the Air Force, my first job actually was to be in charge of a flight of RAF policemen who were guarding an RAF nuclear weapons store. And so, yes, this is a bit of a stroll down memory lane for me, actually.
Well, it's all new to me. Come and show me around. Is it quite strange, Richard, coming back to a facility like this after so many years?
It is. It's also fascinating to look at the perimeter wire again and think about, you know, it's there to keep people out, 2 lines of wire to slow you down so that there's a nice welcome party of security police as you arrive.
And of course the control tower, looks quite ominous even on a sunny day like today.
But it's the central point of the security system. And of course the most interesting thing is it looks directly down past all the doors to where they kept the nuclear weapons.
I'm astonished that I've got the opportunity to walk through this complex. I mean, back in its day, this must have been one of the most secure and secretive sites in the country.
Absolutely. And it's a really fantastic opportunity for us to be able to see it in almost pristine condition.
Well, yeah.
And if you just look up at the end there, can you see that building?
Yes, the orange one, yeah.
That's right. And the little windows in it, 50 caliber machine guns, ready to rake the area with fire if they've got through all of those defences and they're ready to try and break into the doors, one more line of defence.
So absolutely nothing was left to chance?
No, nothing at all. Everything is designed to make sure that these weapons could never be taken, damaged or harmed by anybody. Totally protected and always ready to be used.
Now, you will have seen these weapons during your time when you were protecting them. Give us an idea of the sort of role that they had. I mean, we're talking not about nuclear weapons that would destroy cities, are we? These are tactical nuclear weapons.
That's right. These weapons here are for fighter bombers, Thunderstreaks, and they're designed to be used on the battlefield against the vastly more superior numbers of the Soviet forces. So the fighter bombers will take off from here, they'll go over to the battlefield and they'll drop an atomic bomb on an advancing Soviet Guards tank army, for example. Hiroshima-sized bomb was about 15 kilotons. These could be as small as 1 kiloton. Now that means a blast area maybe half a mile or so. The point is that's what you want because you're trying to target the explosion in the area you need it to be used. You don't want to be destroying a vast area, civilian casualties and so on. You just want to be hitting the military formation.
So seeing a site like this, mothballed virtually almost as a museum, must in some ways please you.
This is great because this is the result of the Cold War having ended and from our point of view the Cold War having been won. The weapons were never used, the weapons have now been taken away. The site is quiet and that's what we really wanted to happen.
It's absolutely amazing. It is eerie, but in a sense there is a beautiful peace about it. The fact that it's now finished its role.
And peace is what it was all about in the end. Let's keep the peace. After 1945, there was tension for years and years, and there were threats and moments in world history where the worst could have happened. But fortunately, we got through that. And now the only noise we've got are the sounds of those birds.
Come on, let's enjoy the sunshine.
From 1958, the thunder streaks at Bentwaters were replaced with nuclear-armed F-101 Voodoos and later F-4 Phantoms. These would become key components in a new tactic called Victor Alert.
The Victor Alert tactic was all about speed, trying to get aircraft into the air within 5 minutes during moments of heightened tension. Pilots would wait next to their Victor Alert barns, which contained their aircraft that were fully fueled, the pilots themselves fully dressed, ready for action. In many ways, it wasn't unlike a scramble during the Battle of Britain, but on these occasions, they were armed with nuclear weapons. At the moment the siren went off, the ground crews would ready their aircraft, pulling out these arming pins, making all of the weapon systems, including the nukes, live. Meanwhile, the pilots would be racing into their cockpits. The pilots who leapt into their aircraft, just like this F-4 Phantom, adrenaline coursing through their veins, had no idea as they taxied out to the end of the runway whether or not they would be taking off into the midst of a full-scale nuclear war. Now, as it turned out, all the Victor Alerts were drills, exercises. They were never called upon to do it for real. But nonetheless, these pilots and their aircraft were in a constant state of readiness.
The British V-bombers used a similar tactic. This large strategic force was fully operational by 1958. It had been specifically developed to deliver the UK's nuclear deterrent.
The Vulcan, along with the other V-bombers, the Valiant and the Victor, became Britain's nuclear deterrent force. This was the only way in which Britain could respond to an attack from the USSR with nuclear weapons until 1969, when the Polaris submarine from the Royal Navy took over that primary role, maintaining our nuclear deterrent. 15 minutes readiness meant you could actually be in a bed somewhere, asleep, and get out of bed, get whisked out to the airplane and get airborne within 15 minutes. And then greater states of readiness, where at 5-minute readiness, we'd be sleeping next to the aircraft in a little porter cabin type thing before they'd invented porter cabins. And then you'd just be in your flying kit, sleeping, and then you'd just have to rush out, jump aboard. And the aircraft were designed so that they could get the engines started and everything going in very, very quick time. 2-minute readiness, you're actually sitting in the seat, and within 2 minutes, the aircraft could get airborne, get out of the way. Because in those days, the best thing that we could do in Britain was had a 4-minute readiness. We had radars detecting inbound missiles. They could then get the message to us, and we would get the scramble order, and we could be airborne before those missiles hit the ground, and a 4-minute warning. For me, I was only flew it from 1971. I was never actually ever found myself in a situation where I really thought something like this could happen. Unlike just only sort of less than 10 years prior to that, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when the crews seriously were in their aircraft, fully armed, up with live nuclear weapons or the Blue Steel standoff missile, and they all didn't know whether the Hooter was really going to go and they were going to get scrambled. Thereafter, in fact, during the time when I flew it, from 1971 till 1982, then yes, we carried our one and only role was low-level nuclear strike, flying low-level, below radar cover, and using a single nuclear bomb, I don't know how many, probably 100 times bigger than Hiroshima, to go against the USSR, and that was our only role. And we played an important role, still part of NATO's Strategic Defence Force, and we would carry on that role right up until it went out of service in 1982. For me, during that whole time, I never really seriously had envisaged that I would actually have to go and drop a nuclear bomb on a city or on an airfield. People say, how could you do it? How could you sleep at night knowing that that was your job, which was my job? And the answer, quite simply, is I never really had lost any sleep over it or worried about it, because I never thought it would come to that. And it never did. I mean, this is the success of the nuclear deterrent was that we actually had the longest era of peace in the country for hundreds of years, I think, well, ever.
Bentwaters remained a nuclear-armed base throughout the fluctuating tensions of the 1960s and the 1970s, but in 1978 the whole place got a much-needed upgrade to better deal with conventional and chemical and biological attack. This rather sinister-looking building was the nerve centre for operations here at Bentwaters and at neighbouring RAF Woodbridge, and it was specifically designed to deal with chemical and biological attack. Now that capability, I am told, has been beautifully preserved on the inside. Well, these enormous blast doors tell you straight away this is no ordinary building. The whole thing was pressurised to keep contaminated air on the outside from getting into the inside. And I'm hoping I'm going to hear the ghostly voice of Graham, who's going to talk me through how I would make it into the nerve centre of RAF Bentwaters if there'd been an attack. Graham, are you there?
Hi Jules, welcome to Bentwaters.
You've just been subjected to a chemical attack, so we need to decontaminate you and walk towards your left towards the first decontam cell, and I'll give you further instructions.
Here we go, decon door number 1. This really is a spooky place. Graham, I'm in decon room number 1.
Right, Jules, what you'll need to do now is to remove all your clothing and place in the chutes that you see beside you.
This is a drill, and don't worry, I'm not going to take all my clothes off, but if it was the real thing, I guess they would go down there, and I would now be naked. Graham? Okay.
Next, you need to move into the shower area.
Graham, I'm in the shower.
You need to pull the chain attached to the shower head to give yourself a really cold shower all over.
I'm not even going to attempt to see if that is live and works. Graham, I've had a shower.
The next stage is to move into the final area where you'll find the towels to towel dry and a change of clothing.
All right, here we go. So this door would have been shut, of course. And look at it, it's like a conventional changing room in a school gym or something. So I put on a change of clothing. Hopefully I'm now decontaminated. And Graham, I think, should be through here. Graham, I think I'm done.
Excellent, come through the door.
At last, the man behind the voice.
Hi, pleased to meet you, Jules.
Good to see you, mate. I mean, that's a really graphic and quite chilling example of the lengths that we've gone to try and protect key personnel from chemical and biological attack.
It is. I mean, the personnel on station were obviously very key to the operation, and like I say, you had to protect them. And chemical attacks were a real threat. Not so much nuclear warfare, because that was always a last resort, and this building couldn't withstand a nuclear weapon.
But what kind of form would those chemical and biological weapons have taken? What could they do to people?
Nerve agents, blister agents, all kinds of nasty things. And they'd tie up key medical personnel on the base, so they really were an annoyance as well as a real threat to people.
And this building was built alongside those extraordinary hangars that are out there on the airfield today.
Yes, we've got 22 hardened aircraft shelters out there. They're all built as part of Project Creek Standard, which was a project throughout United States Air Forces Europe, which saw hardened command shelters, houses, all built up. And the mindset at that time had changed from having aircraft dispersed out on the airfield unprotected to putting all the aircraft under cover to afford them some protection.
So did the construction of buildings like this represent a shift in emphasis, a shift in perspective on what kind of form a future war would take?
It did. We'd moved away from the idea of any future conflict being nuclear, and it was considered that conventional, using chemical and biological weapons, would be the likely form of war.
And I suppose in many ways, I mean, nuclear war meant that nobody would win anything. The world would be completely destroyed. So a conventional war allows you to have something to capture, to own, I suppose.
Exactly, that's it. No one really wanted to see a nuclear conflict because, like I said, there would be nothing left for people to come back to.
Now, this was the nerve centre of Bentwaters. Can we take a closer look at where the action really happened?
Certainly, follow me.
Wow. So this was where
all the action would have unfolded.
Yeah, this is the operations room. Take yourself back to 1980. This is the base as it was then, with 6 squadrons of A-10s, 4 here at Bentwaters, 2 at Woodbridge. And the important thing to mention about the A-10 is that it signified a change of role for the base. No longer was nuclear strike part of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing's role. It changed to ground attack. And the A-10s based here didn't actually fly and fight from here. They were readied and sent to the front line in Germany to 4 forward operating locations.
So in a way, they were kind of passing through Bentwaters. When the balloon went up, they'd ship their squadrons to Europe, and that was their role done.
That's exactly it. The base would be redundant. These boards symbolise the state of readiness for each of the aircraft that was based at both Bentwaters and Woodbridge.
That's a very significant change in role from a base that was originally conceived to deliver nuclear weapons to the battlefield. Now it's moved on, and it's simply placing its units in Europe ready to go.
That's right, that's it. The battlefield for the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing with the A-10s was the east-west border, where all the Soviet tanks would be the big threat to Allied forces.
And the A-10 famously nicknamed, of course, the Tank Buster.
That's it.
Yeah. Did you just open the door and find this complete?
Unfortunately not. This was totally stripped out when we took it over. It was like a blank canvas.
Yeah.
Luckily for us, the equivalent building at RAF Alcombe was about to be demolished, and we managed to get in the nick of time to recover all the equipment and put back in here.
And how accurately have you managed to recreate this?
We had no photographs to work on, as the building was so secret. Very few people were actually allowed access in it, but we did have one photograph to go by, which covered one area of the room. And we've had people come back who used to be based here and have said we've done a pretty good job.
Do any of those visitors give you any more detail? Can they talk about how secret it was in here?
They can't, because they've signed on the dotted line when they joined up, so everything's secret.
Well, certainly you've recreated the atmosphere, and I think it's fascinating for someone like me and like you who grew up during the Cold War to be able to come into a building like this and see what was going on behind the scenes that none of us knew anything about.
It is, it's absolutely fascinating. And there's still buildings like this in existence at places like Mildenhall and Lakenheath, and we even get serving USAF personnel come back to come and have a look inside this building so they can get an idea of what they can't see at Lakenheath or Mildenhall, which is quite funny.
You're lifting the lid on the Cold War.
We are, yes.
Brilliant. Now, just as cracks were beginning to show in the Soviet Union towards the end of the 1980s, the Americans here decided to redecorate. These rather crude-looking murals pop up all over Bentwaters, but there's more to them than meets the eye. This hardened aircraft shelter was occupied by members of the aggressor squadron. Their job was to play the Russians during training exercises, and that's why they've decided to cover their hangar with a great big Russian bear.
The 80s were actually the frostiest period of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was a time in which there was an effort across the military to really visualize the enemy. On the outside of buildings, you would often see the use of official symbols, whether that was the insignia of the branch or of the different aircraft. Meanwhile, inside the buildings, you might see things that were a bit less refined. A lot of the murals that you see at Bentwaters were kind of informally created. They would have been done by individual airmen or groups. So they weren't using, terribly artistic materials. They weren't designed for a sense of, aesthetic quality. They were designed to build morale. One of the things that you saw created in the murals were an effort by different airmen to capture the insignia of their fighter wing. So one of the murals depicts a blue dragon. That's the symbol of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing. In that mural, the blue dragon is kind of holding Great Britain as though it's a rock guitar in his hand. And the idea was it's kind of showing the spirit of cooperation between Britain and the United States.
The artwork found on many bases is firmly rooted in contemporary street culture. But there was a darker side to the designs.
So there's a lot of symbolism that appears in these murals. One of the things you see is that in one of the ammo or munitions group murals, you see an Air Force member who appears as Death. And the idea really is that in the Cold War, the United States and Britain were up against a foe that didn't really have a face, but that caused a lot of fear. So death sort of symbolizes the idea that death could come at any moment. There's one mural that has the slogan, "We live so that others may die." And this was a mural of the munitions branch. The slogan was a reminder of the constant presence of nuclear warfare during the Cold War. There was the possibility of the annihilation of a large part of the globe at any moment. And the munitions branch obviously would have been critical to that taking place. And the murals really brought that sense of home and identity to the different organizations within the military. They created a visual reminder of what it was these individuals were fighting for and who they were fighting against.
The Cold War finally ended in the early 1990s. The prolonged standoff and arms race had exhausted Soviet resources and resolve, and helped lead eventually to greater political and economic reform. As the relationship between the West and the East improved, the need for bases like Bentwaters diminished, and it was handed back to the British government in 1993. Today, it's privately owned, and only a handful of aircraft still use it. But it's a poignant reminder of this unique period in history.
I was born in 1970, just a few months after Neil Armstrong famously set foot on the moon. And like millions of other people, I lived through the next 20 years, the latter half of the Cold War, facing the threat of nuclear Armageddon. Growing up just a few miles from here, I went to school with kids whose fathers served and flew from bases just like Bentwaters and its sister stations. But as I look back on the Cold War, there is a certain irony to it. Both sides have developed the capability to destroy themselves and the world many times over, but in many senses, that in itself helped to preserve the peace. Well, today, the runway here at Bentwaters is silent, but this entire complex, I think, serves as a powerful reminder of the threat that we once all faced of a war that really would have ended all wars.